To orient you really quickly, the Science Communication Initiative, or YSci as we call it, is a grassroots, campus-wide initiative which envisions a campus community that values, supports, and creates effective science communication and engagement. Our board is comprised of representatives from 14 units on campus, and you can find more information about us at uyo.edu/WYSCI. And also, if you're interested, we distribute a weekly newsletter of events on campus that relate to sharing science or getting better at sharing science. And there's a sign-up sheet for that newsletter that's on the table in the entryway. We also have some copies of the presenter bios. We don't have a script today, but if you'd like a closer look at someone's bio, you can find that out there. And our presenters have brought not handouts exactly, but because none of us have a presentation prepared, we thought that it might be nice to have a little more tangible idea of some of the places that we're talking about. So I think each of our presenters, or at least a couple of them, brought a couple of printouts of some photographs of some of the places they work and some of the people they work with. So we'll circulate those. Just note there's only one copy of each piece of paper, so if you can keep them going so other folks in the room can get a visual of what we're talking about, that would be great. All right, next, the format for this panel is hopefully, like I said, an open discussion. I'm going to start with a couple of questions, and I'm going to plan to kind of pose your questions also directly to individual members of the panel, as opposed to, okay, everybody talk about that question. That way, hopefully, we'll get to have a number of discussions raised, and everyone on the panel will have an opportunity to say a few things. All right, so here we go. Our panelists today are Judy Antell, here in the middle. Judy is an enrolled member of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe from the White Earth Reservation. Prior to her retirement from UW in 2014, she was the founding director of the American Studies program, or of American Studies, which is now called Native American and Indigenous Studies. And from 2014 to 2017, she served as director for UW's High Plains American Indian Research Institute. Her education includes undergraduate and master's degrees in sociology and a doctoral degree in ethnic studies from UC Berkeley. Judy is also an active member of the Institutional Review Board for the Rocky Mountain Tribal Leaders Council. This board evaluates research proposals on behalf of Montana and Wyoming tribes. Saida Esmaili, who was slated to be one of our panelists, had to change some travel plans due to the storm, so she's sadly not able to join us. Next, we have Jimena Golche Benavides, and she is a PhD student in program in ecology and a member of Katie Wagner's lab at the University of Wyoming. She is passionate about tropical fishes, and in her research, she focuses on understanding the origin and maintenance of freshwater fish diversity. Jimena did her undergrad in her native Costa Rica, a master's in Germany studying cichlid fishes found only in Nicaraguan crater lakes, and since 2015, Jimena has been studying cichlid fishes found only in Lake Tanganyika, East Africa. Christine Porter is associate professor and the Wyoming Excellence Chair in Community and Public Health in the Division of Kinesiology and Health at the University of Wyoming. She focuses on teaching, action, and research to address health disparities and build equitable, healthy, democratic, and sustainable food systems. So many thanks to you all, and thanks in advance for sharing your insights, and here we go. Okay, so the first question is for Jimena, and if you will share that mic, I think it should be live. The question is, how is science, or your role as a scientist, perceived by the people who live where you do your research?
Can you all hear me well? Yes, good. Thanks for that question and for the opportunity to be here. So one of the first things of my role as a researcher in Africa, or what I believe is how people see me, is a little bit like an alien, like some strange person. I'm strange in any context, but in being so far just to study wildlife has already a layer of not normal, something out of the normal. For example, to study fish, I use scuba diving equipment, and I conduct these surveys underwater wearing a gas tank and so an oxygen tank to breathe underwater. And when I am getting out of the water, very often I would find rows of kids and children just gathered around the rocks just to watch me. What is this strange creature doing? So, but then in a more general sense, how I like to be seen is just like anyone else. I want to be able to not only obtain the data and the information that I'm trying to collect and to preserve, but also I want to give back, and I'm there to see how I can contribute to the local communities. So that's how I would like to be seen.
Thanks. A quick question for Judy next. Judy, how do you involve or recommend involving local people in your science?
You know, that's a big issue for the kind of work that I used to do before I retired, and still do a bit in my retirement. I work with indigenous communities in the United States, and I also have some experience working with Maori communities in New Zealand. And when we talk about how do we go about research, that's a really important question to us for a lot of historical as well as contemporary reasons. If I could be so bold, I brought a couple of very short quotations that I thought might help provide a bit of context for my remarks. These quotations are, I'm hoping you can hear me. These quotations are from writers that are both, Vine Deloria Jr. has passed, but Linda Smith is still with us. Both of these writers and researchers were important to the question of research with indigenous communities. The first quotation begins, "Academia and its byproducts continues to become more irrelevant to the needs of the people." Vine Deloria wrote that in 1969 in his book, Custer Died for Your Sins. The second quotation begins, "Research was talked about both in terms of its absolute worthlessness to us, the indigenous world, and its absolute usefulness to those who wielded it as an instrument." Linda Smith here is talking about her experience with her iwi, her indigenous communities, her tribal communities, if you will, in New Zealand. And she's reflecting on how folks, when she was growing up, thought about research and science included in that as well, social sciences and humanities. To go on, it told us things already known, suggested things that would not work, and made careers for people who already had jobs. And this is, as I've said, from Linda Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies, her second edition published in 2012. So obviously 43 years have passed between Deloria's statement and Smith's. And these two statements are not so different, are they? And I think they beg the question, has anything changed? And if not, why not? I've been so fortunate to be involved with two efforts. I think that's a fair way to express these things that I'm about to offer. And both of them, I believe, have been key routes for indigenous peoples to bring research in a valid and useful way into their own communities. So the first effort with which I was involved was the High Plains American Indian Research Institute. And if indigenous peoples can find a way into the academy, be it an institute or a department or a group of administrative advocates or faculty advocates, so that they have a voice in how research is being conceived and implemented, carried out, and where those results of the research are going. That's really key, I think, in relationships between the academy and indigenous communities. So the High Plains American Indian Research Institute was designed with that in mind. And the mission of the Institute is to facilitate research relationships between UW faculty and other researchers, of course, grad and undergraduate students and staff as well, and tribal communities in this region. Research that supports tribal sovereignty and nationhood and research that results in long-term beneficial results to the tribal communities involved. So that's the mission of the Institute, and I think these kinds of places are critically important so that Indigenous peoples can find some kind of relevance and value in research that's being conducted. And I think another path is community-based, grassroots activist research, and that's another project with which I've been involved most recently, and that is this is very heavy on the culture side and the social science and humanities side, and that is understanding and communicating the role of elk on the Wind River Indian Reservation. I won't be talking a lot about that study per se or that endeavor, but both of these avenues I think are important to bring science and bring our expertise in the academy in a good way, in a helpful way, into Indigenous communities. So that's a real long preface to my answer to the question, but maybe I've used all my time. Are you sure? Because I don't, okay. So one of the things that we've done, the question was how do we bring research into communities? We do it in lots of ways, but one way is very obviously by inviting the community to participate, and by starting out our proposals in a team effort with the community involved from the very beginning. So if we're thinking about a question that we would like to address as researchers, and we want to bring that question to, in this case, my experience being tribal communities here in the United States, you involve them in the proposal from the beginning. What should the proposal look like? How can it best benefit you? Because the purpose of any research that we do with communities, whatever they be, and Indigenous communities in this case, that's what I was invited to speak about, is to make sure that the research is relevant and important to them. So bringing them into the research design, bringing them every step of the way into the process. So having an advisory committee, having a council of people who will give their services and advise, making sure that the research is in fact important for them and of benefit to them. That's the question we should always ask as researchers. What good am I doing for the people I'm researching? Why is this work important? Certainly, and we have to face this reality, it's important for academics because they're in a career trajectory. We all get that. But we can still do good research that's important for other people too, and that's where I think we should be. And I could go on and on and on with a very detailed response, and I will not, about how Indigenous peoples can be involved in the research process, but I'm confident that you get my drift. And so I will leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Judy. To follow up with Christine, I think Christine may be able to speak to some detailed examples of what you were getting at, Judy. So, Christine, if you could share with us your thoughts on access to and participation in science. Here we go.
Well, I could start with the Smith quote that Judy kindly said, and also thank you for being here. I'm glad to be here. About people are the research told us things already known, suggested things that would not work, and made careers for people who already had jobs. Obviously, my whole life work would be wasted if I was doing work like that, and at the same time, I have totally participated in that, right? Like every time we publish, it's good. Every time I publish is good for my career. Every time I get a grant, it's good for my career in a way that it isn't good for anyone else who's part of my projects as an academic partner, as a community partner. As a community partner or as a participant. So for projects I have done that are action research and trying to create food security or enough food for all people in the ways that they see that they want for their communities, I've been able, for example, to bring money to pay for some of that work, but I keep my job here after that project's over. And then the last time I had a project that was going for 5 years, $5 million, called Food Dignity. When that was over, three of the people who needed jobs most lost their jobs as soon as that project was over, right? So even when I do create the kinds of partnerships that I think, Judy and I mean, all of us would laud as the best kind, it isn't. There's also still the structural issue about who has jobs and who doesn't, whose knowledge counts and who doesn't. How do you count that knowledge? And that's sort of without grasping that, or without at least acknowledging those inequities and doing everything you can to close them, which will not be complete, given the systems we're working in. But for me, I call it academic supremacy. Essentially, when you're in a university-community relationship, I'm not talking about us collaborating with Monsanto, right? Monsanto might have more power than definitely has more power than University of Wyoming. But if I'm working with Blue Mountain Associates in Wind River Indian Reservation or Dig Deep Farms in Oakland area, California, I am bringing much more privilege and systemic privilege to that relationship than no matter how much we share development of the research questions and share the data gathering and analysis, there are these structural inequities. And I have learned the hard way, or my community partners have taught me the hard way, that I cannot do this work in a good way if I don't acknowledge those systemic inequities and do my best to close them. But even when I can't close them, I better be naming them and not pretending it's some other way.
Thank you, Christine. Let's shift gears a little bit. I'll reach out with these and folks can have a look around, and maybe we can take some questions from the audience. Does anyone have a thought, a question, a what-if scenario that we can consider? Otherwise, I still have a hefty list of things that can keep us talking. Rhiannon, I'll repeat your question so we get it through transcription and everything. So the question is about grant writing strategy and the ethics of writing grants that are meaningful to the communities that you work in, and how you identify potential mismatches or potentially really fundable synergies.
Yes, there are, and going back to sort of the thing I was just saying, it's partly about being clear about the compromises and making sure everyone is knowing what they're compromising. And I will use the example of, so I had this 5-year project that I was talking about called Food Dignity. It was case studies and qualitative research and action and education. I'm still mystified how we got money for that, but it was amazing and great, and there were fewer tensions. There were still tensions in that issue, but then, and this isn't actually also about how you become partners in a research project, is that in Food Dignity, I was, and the other academic partners, but we're listening super carefully to what community partners wanted, not necessarily including asking what research questions do you have, or what would you want to know, or what do you want to try and see if it works, but also just listening, right, without making people do more work to explain in my terms. So in Wind River, Blue Mountain Associates was the community partner there, and clearly people wanted to garden. Many more people wanted to garden than had the resources to do so. Often they had the expertise but not the money, or they had the expertise and the money but not the labor, like the physical capacity, or some mix of that. And so Blue Mountain, in Food Dignity, there wasn't enough. More people wanted gardens than could be supported in that project. So this is a compromise, but I said, well, we could pay for a lot of gardens if we ask a research question about the gardens. What are the health impacts of gardens? So the project I'm in the middle of now with NIH funding with several partners in Wind River is called Growing Resilience, and it's a randomized controlled trial about the health impacts of home gardens. And it's paying for 96, was supposed to be 100 families. We have 96 families who are getting new home gardens that they wanted, and they're having health data gathered before and after because it's a controlled trial, and this is an ethical tension. Half the people had to wait 2 years before they got their gardens, right? They sign up, they want a garden now, but they get randomized. Get a garden now, delayed intervention to be the control. So that was the main compromise. Something that's interesting about it, though, is I thought the health data gathering might be a burden, perceived as a burden, but the participants have also loved that. They've loved monitoring their health, and the people who are done with their study, like, can we keep coming and keep on having these data sessions? So now I'm like, okay, what else do we do so we can keep on at least measuring people's health? How do we keep supporting the gardens? We're developing the next project out of that project, but it's a really intensive listening and a great creativity into being a bridge to the research gaps, you know, that the funders might consider as a research gap, and then negotiating or discussing and compromising with partners about what's worth doing. In this case, the big compromise was having people wait 2 years, and also it's only enough for 100 families. Like, we couldn't take more, and then also it's going to end. That's the other problem with research, right? Our biggest failure in food dignity was not building in the sustainability inherently not in an ecological sense, but in a financial, social sense. Like, research projects end. And so that's the other ethical tension. So it's not always a perfect match. And there are many things that we should be able to do that I cannot figure out how to turn into a research question that's fundable.
No, okay. I'd like to just underscore something Christine has been discussing, and that is that when we do research with Indigenous communities, I think it's very important when we talk about offering something to them, it's more than the results of the research. It means bringing community members into the process in an employable and a paid way. So we're paying people to be participants. We're offering an economic boost to the community, and also we're training people. People who would like to know more about research or data collection or data analysis or whatever. The list is obviously long. So I know in Christine's work that's been key. I'd also like to just say a couple of things rather quickly. More and more funders, I think, are becoming sensitive to the fact that research proposals need to be relevant to the communities for which they're designed to be a partner. And so it's not as easy to get funding for the old-fashioned kind of proposal where the folks we're working with are simply research objects or subjects. So that's one thing. More and more universities are trying to be sensitized too. It's been a real slog, folks. It's taken, decades to get these kinds of things that Delory was talking about in 1969 out into the daylight and addressed. Academia is a slow-moving, beautiful machine, and we just have to live with that. Institutes like, in our case at UW, we have the High Plains American Indian Research Institutes, but universities all over have these. They could be at the department level, at the college level, at the university level, however, but having some place on a campus for researchers to go to get ideas and help with writing proposals that are relevant and useful. So those are my comments.
Very small. So my background is from the one branch of biology that not necessarily implies a social dimension directly, but inherently because it deals with biodiversity and conservation and on the study of biodiversity in itself that we all as humans benefit from, then it has like this indirect implication for societies. And even if it is not expected from us to include that in our grant proposals, there are several ways in which we can add at least a component in which we either involve a human dimension or yes, you just produce something to at least not leave the knowledge stuck in obscure articles that only academics will read, but maybe making it more accessible for everybody. Oh, yes, so there's been like a little children's book I actually prepared as a material to give to, so I've mentioned these kids were always curious, like, what is she doing? Right? And I'm documenting these species that are found there nowhere else in the world. They could disappear without us knowing they existed in the planet. And I'm so excited about this, but of course there's the whole communication barrier. So I just thought, to me it would be more intuitive I love children's books as a kid, so I prepared like these little drawings trying to simplify the kind of like the ecological role of these species. And of course I didn't give them the English versions. I had actually some friend helped me translate, actually in the audience, Brand, to Swahili. And then I was able to have a little children's book with the very simple text in Swahili to give back to these kids, and they were so excited to have it.
And since you have the mic, Jimena, those of you who've seen the pictures, this is going to register for you. If you haven't seen them yet, hopefully you will soon. But there's also a picture of a whole bunch of people with computers. Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, so my advisor, Katie Wagner, included on her NSF grant that has funded part of me being able to go to Africa. She included a component in which she would train local fisheries biologists in programming. So together with my lab mate, Jessica Rick, another PhD student, we actually taught this little introduction to programming in R workshop at the local fisheries. So that's the photos of the last little handout of the participants that were involved, that they were happy to use this open source programming tool, which is called R. So as long as anybody has access to a computer, they can use it anywhere in the world and access a universe of different tools to do data analysis and learn from the types of data that they are already collecting.
Thank you.
Add something real quick
You bet. That's what we're here for.
One other comment I just wanted to make. I feel that I talk too much about the responsibility of the academy and funding agencies with regard to making sure that research designs are correctly in place and that the research is carried out in an appropriate manner. I'd like to speak really briefly to the fact that tribal communities or indigenous communities around the world are really taking responsibility for this themselves and are stepping up and are saying, we have our own research standards now, and you need to comply with them. We'll help you understand what we expect and what we need, and we're not going to allow you into our communities anymore. We're just not going to participate in continuing this kind of exploitation. And so there's real agency in tribal communities now, and the Institutional Review Board, of which I'm a part, represents tribes in Wyoming and Montana and Idaho, and that Institutional Review Board was put into place to read proposals, people that would like to do work in Indian country, and help those researchers strengthen their proposals and to have the ability to sometimes say no. We need to go a little bit different direction with this, and this is why. So the purpose is to be helpful, but it does have Institutional Review Board standing. And tribes are doing their own. They have their own research offices, their own IRBs, and that's just a real step forward. So I wanted to not in any way overlook that. Did you have a comment, Christine?
Thank you for that context, Judy. Anyone else in the room? Thoughts? Scenarios? Jessica, I'll repeat your question. So the question is if there's any advice or commentary as a response to a common science assertion that I'm doing pure research and therefore there is no real application. So I either can't or don't need to bring that into the community where I work. Christine's got her hand up.
And I get that mostly in the health sciences, right? I'm in health science, so there are people who do like bench biomolecular health, so that's at least where I'm coming from. And I would say a few things. I mean, one is, in terms of the ethics of research, we often think about ethics in science as how we apply what we learned, as opposed to also deriving what research questions we ask. So for me, part one is, well, what in your pure science, what research are you questioning? What research questions are you asking, and to whom are you accountable ultimately for those answers, right? If you're finding a cure for cancer, then people who are affected, by cancer are those folks, or communities that are losing species and therefore their ecologies are falling apart. And in that sense, you have accountability ultimately, even if they're not your collaborators in your lab. The other way, or that your work has illustrated, Jimena, is the dissemination of your pure science results, and we should be ultimately accountable, I think, to the public, aside from individual stakeholder groups, who pays for our work, who pays for our salaries. And the children's book is brilliant on that front. And the working in of, and this is actually the funding question too, so real pure science grants are in the millions, sometimes multi-millions if they're multi-year. You can work in essentially projects with a social mission of diversifying science, of training people who are in the field in the communities that are affected or part of your work, and for pennies on your research dollar, right? You can buy those computers and do those trainings. You can have a program that is about, in the schools that are related to what you're doing. And the funders won't even notice because those lines are so small compared to the total grant, but very big for building in those actions. And so sometimes, and I would say this in Growing Resilience, the most important thing in that randomized controlled trial, right? NIH is paying for the randomized controlled trial about the health impacts, but we're paying for a lot of other things that we actually think are more important, that cost less than running an RCT, right? And so any science can work that in, and I think should. So from both the research question and then, what you actually do with some grant that you got, and the dissemination.
I just wanted to add that, yes, in I feel like in my training as a graduate student, I've had this impression, at least in my field, where the people I've admired the most are interested in evolutionary biology, and it's hard to bring this as a societal, even if there are plenty of creative ways and not even that far away from us in which we should care for evolutionary biology. But yeah, I feel very identified in this, and I not necessarily have learned it from, except for my advisor right now, but I feel like it's not common that researchers that are very driven into their own academic careers, it's like a very like tunnel vision type of, and I kind of reacted to that in a sense that I've been like, I want to at least in the way where I can, in the aspect of disseminating this knowledge that I think it's so cool, like finding ways in which I could contribute, and that even brought me here. So in Denver, there's a cichlid hobby, so a very specific African fish hobby association for the Rocky Mountains that meets in Denver every month, believe it or not. But I was able to meet with somebody who participated and got invited to give a talk on the science aspect, and I took it as an opportunity also to so not only bring some results of the findings that I'm doing and the science that I find interesting, but also just breaking stereotypes and sharing, also learning from the knowledge that they gather from seeing my study organism as their favorite hobby too. So both ways.
Thank you, Jimena. Go for it, Livy. Okay. So the question is, if I can put it in a nutshell, wave at me if I miss a part. Scientists, especially academic scientists, are responsible for so much in their work already, writing grants, teaching, research. They're expected to be good at all of those things. Some scientists who consider outreach of some sort or public engagement to be really important don't know how they're going to fit that in with everything else that they do, and so they assert that it should not be required. Can you speak to that, any of you?
So to me, there's both an individual, it's an individual issue, right? I mean, there are people who are maybe, sounds like your chair, maybe the three of us, if I can say that, right, who are trying to push science as a discipline, as a field, into making that a laughable claim, almost, like that's outrageous because your work is paid and whatever. On the other hand, as a, we work, it doesn't mean we have that expertise, doesn't mean we have the bandwidth, whatever. So I think to some extent it's a cultural shift and / personal responsibility and / our grantors are making us do it increasingly, right? There's a dissemination section now in grants where there did not used to be. And so you better have a plan, and they're taking it more and more seriously, I feel like. Not that I've been in this game that long. But I also feel like as institutions, almost more important, like if institutions don't hold us to account for that and it's not valued by our institutions and by our tenure promotion process, for example, then we're also still not going to count it, or do it. And I would say I could actually use professional help in messaging. I just went to a framing workshop this morning about how to frame our science, right? And it's not that every person needs to be trained on that. I think, especially public universities, should have teams that they reach out to faculty, and it's their job to make us and help us disseminate our research and not rely on individual people to write children's books, as awesome as that is, but a lot of our research could be turned into that, right? Anyway, so and so you could put it into a grant, right? Like you hire a person to do it, even if you can't do it yourself, especially the big ones. But I think our institutions also and our funders should hold us accountable for that. Yeah, whose responsibility is it?
So the addendum from the audience is that work-life balance, again for academic scientists, I think in this context, is already so hard. So whose responsibility is it? Judy?
Just a comment to extend a bit what Christine was saying. It's really part of the university culture, and I think as faculty, as students, as consumers of the university, as community members, we really need to make that clear. Universities have research offices. It's part of their culture. It's part of their expectation. We run our proposals through those IRBs on campus. That needs to be part of the IRB. That needs to be part of their mission to make sure that what we're doing is relevant research that brings our work to the communities in a good way and that partners with the communities, not just one-sided, that we're bringing something, but that we're learning, that we're asking for help, that we're asking for guidance. That's how the enrichment process works, I think.
I agree, and I just would like to add that I find a lot of motivation to do this type of things because I know how these academic culture sometimes appears as a bubble because not everybody has access to same educational opportunities. So I find it like as a way to be, I find it like a good motivation for me to be able to share with, just as people shared with me and welcome me to this bubble, I want to share with others, and I find a lot of energy. And just as my advisor has, I'm lucky that also my advisor encourages this, definitely.
Quick and totally shameless plug. That's why we established YSci a couple of years ago, because we feel like that's a resource on campus that otherwise doesn't exist. There are lots of people doing lots of outreach work, but we perceived a pretty serious gap in resources to help people get better at that, to think about it, and to think about it on a lot of axes. And so very, very briefly, we offer all sorts of trainings and thinking and conversation sessions like this one. We also are working to build up a community of people who do this kind of work and know each other on campus, so we don't all feel isolated in our commitment to doing this kind of work. And also we work within that community objective to connect people to the very extensive and growing body of literature on the science of science communication, which intersects with things like the science of teaching and learning and a lot of indigenous studies work. There's lots of intersections, and for folks that are looking for development in those capacities, we have resources or can point you to people on the campus or beyond. And then our final objective, and we're being recorded, is to significantly contribute to shifting the culture around tenure and promotion, so that this work is not seen as an add-on. It's seen as an expected and built-in part of the work that people do. And so if I could summarize what we've all set up here, it sounds to me like everyone with a mic accessible to them at the moment thinks that it shouldn't be optional. You know, maybe something else needs to give if something needs to give, but maybe our social contract obliges us to do this work. Maybe not maybe. Okay, anyone else in the room? Go for it, I'll repeat your question. Okay, so if at the conception and planning stages your project overlooks a community connection, what can you do about that later?
I think you modify as you go along. That's one thing you can do, and you have interactions with your funder. You need at some point to go back if there was maybe a wrong foot put forward in the beginning, back out a little bit and start over. That's possible. That's one way you can do it. We all are imperfect, right? We learn as we do these things. Sometimes we have big surprises that we didn't expect, and we go, oh wow, I never thought of that. Well, now I do. Thank you for helping me, and let's try to work on this differently and better. So that's just kind of an off-the-cuff response to what you might do.
And also back out a little, I mean, sometimes we do research that we want to do, it's not onerous on a community, say, and it's not doing them harm, say, that maybe people don't want to be involved. I just want to point that out. That can happen. You need to ask, right? And you need to ask if it's okay. And if you haven't done that, we could talk about what to do, but in a second. But also, it's also true that not everyone always wants to be involved, and not in all phases of the research, right? But it's important people have the opportunity. And when you have not provided that opportunity, I've advised people before, if there's money involved, that you carve out a pot of money, and you're like, what do you want to do? And here, would you like to participate in this at all? And would you like to have, this block of funding and design your own thing, and I'll help you figure out how to do that? So, but most of all, that you have to say, you better name it. I really messed up. Like, I am really sorry. It is not okay that we got this far. What can I do to make it right? And that, what I just said, would be one example. But naming it and apologizing and not making any excuses. You might have reasons, but you don't have any excuses, and that's how it would start. And then ask about how to make it up, including having already done some homework about some options, especially financial and staffing support that you could offer that would actually help make up for some of that error. And also maybe they'll be like, get out of here. Like, okay, I'll do better next time.
I think I can speak for my fellow panelists when I say none of us is an expert up here. We all learn, as I said, every time we write a proposal, every time we work with a community, we do misstep, and we have to be open to saying, I'm sorry, I didn't think of that. thank you for helping me reconsider this, and let's move in a different direction. And so that's part of it. It's just a very dynamic process.
One quick thought on that too, and if I'm telling you things you already know, practice makes perfect. But something else that we can do is not put all the emotional and intellectual labor on the communities that we engage with. You know, asking them to explain to us why what we did is wrong is not often fair, let alone productive. And so when we're in circumstances where we realize something's gone wrong, especially if it's the community that we're working with, it says a huge amount about our relationship with them already if they are willing to call us out on it instead of just shut down, disengage, whatever. So there's a relationship that somebody thinks is significant enough to tell you about an issue they're having with you, and then there is a lot of work that we can do, especially now that the internet exists and we have exceptional, truly useful resources on campus through the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and through HAPARI, and individuals on campus who have experience with this, who can help you do your own work first, so that by the time you get yourself into a space where you are trying to overcome something that you may have created as an issue, you're not looking to the people who are already in a pickle because of your behavior to be the ones who help you fix it. They can, and I suspect I'm not leveling too much on top of what Judy and Christine were saying. When they say help us help you, it's not help me. It's, you know, I've thought hard about this. I think I better understand where this went wrong. What can we work on together? And that approach, as opposed to showing up and going, okay, well, you be Wikipedia, is much more productive. Anyone out? Oh, Christine, you want to add to that?
I would just say, in terms of my not being an expert in mistakes, I mean, the hardest part, I think mapping stakeholders is not that hard if you have your eyes open. It's having an equitable relationship with stakeholders. That's where I mess up 5 times a day. And that's when I'm not really working, right? I mean, that's for me, that's for someone who's really trying, that's been just saying. It's not that easy to do it well, including in the context of what I called academic supremacy, right?
Anyone else? Thoughts on that, or more thoughts on anything else? We still have a few minutes. Connor. Okay, so the question is about when you're working with community partners, co-researchers, whatever the relationship might be, are there instances when a monetary incentive or a monetary exchange of some sort isn't really appropriate, and what other arrangements might be appropriate?
I just think there's a variety of ways that you can work with communities. Fair pay for expertise and talent that you're asking people to help you with as partners is certainly possible, and I think that's a good way to go. But there are other things that you can do. You could buy with grant funding, possibly, depending upon your funder. Think about providing material for the school, or think about providing a piece of equipment for a community center, or think about offering some workshops to train people who may be interested in a particular facet of the research. And we're always big on gift cards. We do a lot of that in the community, those kinds of things. But people need to be respected and compensated, I think, for their involvement.
I would double down on the money. Assuming you have money, right? Some projects don't, and then you better be negotiating. Okay, well, what would make this valuable, right? That is on the table, but always money. We get paid. Well, if you're a grad student, you get a stipend if you're lucky. But if for once you're in the profession, we are paid. We should be paying people appropriately. Period. And the only time when otherwise it would be negotiated because there is no money involved and it's still, people think it's worthwhile enough to do, okay? You try to leverage other resources that institutions have, including in the ways you described, potentially. But third, occasionally people do not want money for concrete reasons. Like they don't want to go over a benefit level and then they're gonna lose their benefits, or they don't want to deal with the taxes, or they're not allowed. And then that's when I usually talk about other, paying all the expenses to go to a conference or something for their organization rather than for the person. But, and I also it's the difference between a participant and a collaborator are light years different, right? I mean,
I could also add that it's been very important. So I've benefited from getting opportunities as first I worked a lot for research, biological research as a field assistant, and then benefited, even if I didn't got monetary pay, I did get recommendation letters, and I heard, so just having these people as mentors and connecting me with opportunities was very valuable for me to be able to pursue that same path. So I just want to say that, like opportunities that involve education are perhaps even more important than money in many cases, but if there's the possibility of pay, that would be even better.
Anyone else? We might have time for one more. So the question is how you deal with circumstances where you are essentially creating an imbalance in benefits in the community. Only certain people get to benefit or get to participate. And, if you didn't propose that project in the first place, that conflict might not even exist.
I think that's where your advisory board is helpful, and I think communicating as best you can with the community to let them know why are these families participating and why are these families not, and having an advisory board or a group of people working with you from the community can help navigate those difficult waters and can help negotiate that terrain a little bit. It is difficult, and those things do happen. That's a reality. But not isolating yourself as the researcher, but asking for help and support from the community. That's one thing that I think of.
And the Community Advisory Board for the Growing Resilience Project is actually trying to make, they're collaborating with, they're taking the lead, and I'm collaborating with them, I guess we put it that way, about trying to make the gardening program sustainable. And if our results show that gardens impact health in a positive way, this is also a risk. We don't know what the results will show. Let's hope they show that gardens affect health in a positive way. It'll be easier to get more program funding in a more sustainable way, right, rather than research funding. And then building on listening to the community. Okay, well, what's next for this? What else should we do together? But it's not a perfect answer by any stretch. But also, I will say, it's also about, put it this way, I have committed to work with people there for the rest of my life for as long as people want to. So I will always show up and try to, I can't promise I can make things happen any more than reverse, but it's a personal commitment. And I think that matters in addition to having the community advisory board tell me, guide me. So even if I don't succeed, it doesn't have that poisoning effect that could happen. So even when people can't get in, I feel like it hasn't come, people just look at it as another reason for hoping and planning and growing the next thing. if that makes sense.
I am not an expert on this at all, but I was just wondering, so my impression would be that if some part of the community would also get, is seeing some benefits and that the other part is able to witness, it might just get more encouraged to be part of it than weary to researchers in the first place. But that's just a thought.
All right, we probably have to wrap up. Do any of you have any closing thoughts you want to leave us with? All right. I think it's probably safe to say that everyone on the panel would be perfectly happy to continue this conversation in whatever level of privacy or openness might be appropriate for what you have in mind to talk about. All of us do think a lot about these kinds of things. There's a number of questions we didn't get to in terms of positive policy impacts, you know, stuff that happens that you weren't even planning on or having any control over, and how science information gets used. So if you're interested in more conversation about this, you can follow up with us individually or let me know, and we can plan to have another more collective conversation about it. Thank you all for joining us.